Well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to be covering part of what Paul read just now, chapter 34 in Exodus. As we've been working through the book of Exodus, there's been a lot of really good lessons, and I hope to be able to give another one tonight. But the thing that I want to be able to point out, though, is some characteristics that I see in this chapter in the book of Exodus. It's pretty straightforward. Marty, I think you covered some of it last Wednesday, and I may overlap some, but I'll try not to reiterate everything. But anyway, I don't have a slideshow tonight. I hear one of the projectors is down, and I don't want to be the one to break the other one. So I'm just gonna go by my notes. No, the covenant gets renewed here in chapter 34 after Israel broke it and broke their end of it. God never breaks his side, but he didn't. He was at the point of cutting them off, and we see in chapter 33 where Moses. He goes up to God and he makes it the pleads with him in a way that God listens and has compassion and mercy on Israel. And that's one of the characteristics, the first characteristic that I really see in this chapter. First of all, if you're taking notes, then I've got about 7 characteristics that I want to cover. First, the one is God is merciful. And we see, even though whenever he is merciful, he's also just. He's got both. He can be both at the same time as well. And we see that even through Jesus' life. And that mercy and justice is one and the same a lot of times. He's going to be just with the children of Israel because of the covenant that he gave to Abraham. The land promise, he's going to be just in allowing them to take over and basically push out and destroy the people living in that land because they were corrupt and sinful. They were sinful nations, and he didn't want them basically influencing the nation of Israel because the seed promise was coming through the nation of Israel. A lot of times people read these events and how the Israelites were able to go in and basically wipe out a lot of these nations, and they're thinking, why would that happen? Why would God allow them to do that? Well, there was a reason. These people were sinful. They were worshiping false gods. They were sacrificing their children to these false gods. There was a lot of corruption there, a lot of immorality, and it had to be taken out. So God is merciful. Let's look in. If you can, turn your Bibles to chapter 34. We're going to start in verse 10. He says, "Behold, I make a covenant before all of your people. I will do marvels such as has not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you." Now, this is a pretty big statement after all the miracles that he performed in Egypt as he was leading them out. All the plagues and parting the Red Sea, all those things. He says, I will do marvels such as not been done in all the earth. So thinking about what are these marvels that he's talking about? What are some of these things that he's referring to here? It's probably, in my opinion, he based off of the next few verses, he's probably talking about the way that he's going to go through and give the land promise as a gift to the Israelites. And in doing so, he does it in a dominating and miraculous way. You just look at the walls of Jericho, how that they basically didn't have to do much. They marched around the city, they blew their trumpets, and the walls fell. It was a real, and then they were able to go in and take over and take over the land. The way that the Jordan parted, I mean, that was similar to the Red Sea. We later we see that's one that happens, but I think he's mainly talking about the way that these nations are going to be basically utterly driven out and destroyed. Because in the next verse here we see, observe what I commanded you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites. I said those more than once there. Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. All right, so here he is talking about all these different nations that they're going to drive out. And these, I think, the victories that they perform with a lot of these nations they were afraid of. And we see later they had to roam around 40 more years just because of the fear of the 12 spies that we read about in Numbers chapter 13, how that they were afraid of these nations. If you look in Numbers 13 verse 33, they described them as giants, and they felt like they were grasshoppers compared to them. So the Israelites were afraid to go in and take over these, even though that they knew or they had seen all these miracles that God had performed for them, and he's reiterating that he's going to do the same to help them do that. These nations were afraid. These kings of these nations were afraid of the Israelites. They knew this was bound to happen after what they did to the Egyptians and the promises that were foretold to Abraham. They were living in that land that they knew that they were going to be taken over. So God gives warnings here with this covenant that he's given here. So that's the second point that I've got here. God gives warnings. He says in verse, I believe it's in verse 12, he says, take heed to yourself. Other versions say, watch yourself. So he's saying, watch out, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. So he's saying you got to make sure you don't make any covenants with these people that you're going into. And he's going to give the reason why in just a minute. But he gives them the warning, watch yourselves, make no covenants with the inhabitants. Then he goes on to tell them, when you go in, you've got to destroy all of the altars to these false gods, break down their sacred pillars for these false gods, and cut down the wooden images, the idols. And verse 14, he says, you shall not worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. This is right after, not too long after they've made the golden calf. So they've got to be reminded, it seems. And so he's reminding them, don't fall back into that. So he's saying, watch yourself, don't make covenants. And the reason he gives right here, if you start giving these, if you start mingling and making covenants with these inhabitants, then it says in verse 15, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifices to their gods, and one of them invites you and you eat the sacrifice. So there's a slippery slope there. You make a covenant with them, then you start worshiping their gods, and then you're eating sacrifices to their gods. Then he goes on to say, and you take his daughters for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. So basically, your sons and their generation, the next generation, will be falling away and worshiping these false gods. He says, you shall make no molten gods for yourselves in verse 17. Here, he's reiterating back, they had just made this molten calf out of gold, and so he's making sure that they don't do that again. This is the warning that he's giving them. Don't fall back into this trap. He might as well have just said, no, don't make any more golden calves, because we see, what happened there. So the third characteristic that I see from God that, is in this chapter, verse 18, we continue to read, he starts to give an expectation of his people to be responsible. So he's merciful, he gives warnings, and he expects his people to be responsible. Here in verse 18, he says, the feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. So he's telling them to observe the feast of unleavened bread. And this is a commemoration of whenever they left Egypt in a hurry, they had to make this bread quickly. They had to make something quickly so that they could get out. And they would have some food to continue on through their journey. In verse 19, he goes on to say, and that the womb, he says, I commanded you ahead of the month of Abib, and then the firstborn, all of the firstborn are mine. Every male among your livestock, whether ox or sheep, but the firstborn of the donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. So here's the reason why he's setting aside the donkey is because the donkey was unclean. They couldn't eat the donkey, so they're going to redeem a lamb for the donkey. And then he goes on, and so there's the donkey. Then there's also the sons. He mentions the sons, the firstborn sons. Those, they could be redeemed with money. So we see in verse 19 and 20, in verse 20 it says, all the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. So they're going to come before him with the redeeming money to give. And he tells us, this is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All right, so this is still in that same context. The next thing in verse 22, he talks about the Feast of Weeks, also known as the Pentecost. The wheat harvest, if you will. So this is 49 days, 7 times 7. So it's also a week of weeks is what it's called. So so there's the unleavened bread, and then there's the Feast of Weeks, which is the Pentecost. So this is this as you continue on reading here. Then the third one is the Feast of Ingathering, or the Tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles. This is at the end of the agricultural year. So to give all this there's a reason for all these instructions here. It's so God can make sure and hold the Israelites responsible for what they should be following as they're going to these feasts, making sure that they do them correctly, and they need to be able to, just like whenever today when we worship, we want to make sure we're doing it according to God, the way He wants it, not the way we want it. A lot of times, we have to tell our kids no because they want to go worship with their friends because they go somewhere fun, and we have to tell them, that's not That's not the way God wants you to worship. And there's a reason. We see throughout all of Scripture, there's a reason why God does this. There's more to it, and if you don't do it in the right way, you're basically bringing condemnation to yourself. Just like the Israelites, when they didn't follow God's commandments to do the things that He specifies here, they're breaking that covenant. And so we need to be aware of following into that. That's part of this warning that He gives. He also expects us to be responsible. He expected the Israelites, His people in the Old Testament, to be responsible, and it's the same God that we worship today. So, that being said, so the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Ingathering, the Pentecost, the Tabernacles, the unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Those are three that they are told that they need to make sure, and they're all based off of the calendar on when they're going to be working their crops. So all of the Israelite males are then in verse 23 and 24. They're told they're commanded to appear during this time. All right. So it says in verse 21, if we back up though, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. Well, why is he bringing up harvest and plowing? Well, it's because of that agricultural calendar. He's basically telling them, even if your crops are ripe and ready to pick, and it's the Sabbath, you don't go out and do it. And as much as I'm sure a farmer would want to go out there and do that, because that's their livelihood, that's how they're going to make money, they have to obey God. And even if they didn't, all their workers are out there, somebody's going to see them. They're going to be known. Everybody's going to know that they're breaking the Sabbath if they did that. So that was part of it. So God expects His people to be responsible. We continue through here. The reason, so the next, in verse 24, after he says all the men need to come, are commanded to appear during these 3 times of the year, the next verse he says, for I will cast out the nations before you and enlarge your borders, neither will any man covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God 3 times in a year. First time I read that, I was like, that doesn't seem like that fits. But if you think about it, the reason is all the men go there. If there's these nations that they had driven out of the land, know that. They know these are the times of the year that they're not there. We can go in and overtake the land. Well, God's telling them right here, you don't have to worry about that. They're not going to do that. So He's giving them that promise and that reassurance that they can worship Him without fear. So in verse 25 he says, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passovers be left until morning. So leavened bread was not to be offered at all. It was in chapter 12 of Exodus, it goes so far as to say, in all your house take out all the leaven for the whole week, all 7 days, take it out, clear it out. And then he also says no leavened bread can be offered alongside with the animal sacrifices. So that's verse 25. Then we go into verse 26. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. So not only are the firstborn in each family to be offered through the money offering, and then also the firstborn of all the livestock were to be offered. But now also the crops were to be offered as well. we continue to read on, and it says, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Well, this seems kind of out of place too, but I don't know. I know what I've read is a lot of the pagans, the other nations around them, they did this, and apparently God didn't want them doing that. I don't know the reason why. Maybe somebody else does. I would think maybe, I mean, this is just my opinion, maybe it was a respect of that life-sustaining milk that the mother gave to the goat should not be boiled with it. That's just, I've heard that. I think that's a good reason. I don't know if that's the reason completely or not, but it makes sense anyway. So we go on and we continue on. The fourth reason, or the fourth characteristic that I see that God has in this chapter is that he gives instructions. And we talked about a lot of this, but there's also, he's going to give the 10 Commandments out again for the second time in verse 27 and 28. And Moses, again, is the mediator. He's God's mediator. He goes up for 40 days and 40 nights, fast, no food, no water during that time. And in verse, so let's look in verse 28, 29. Or 27 and 28. Then the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for according to the tenor of these words, I've made a covenant with you and Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets of the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So Moses, the mediator, and with God's help, renewed the covenant with God's people. So that's the sixth or the fifth characteristic. God provides a mediator. And then immediately after that, we go into what Paul read earlier. This is whenever Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony. They were in his hand. He came down from the mountain, and his skin on his face shone when he talked with them. So there was a brilliant light coming from his face, just as Marty pointed out last week. God displays his glory and his grandeur, and he's displaying it through Moses. It's blasting out so that they all see it. Now, one thing that is pointed out, that Dustin pointed out here, is that word that for horn was mistranslated whenever Jerome wrote the Latin Vulgate, whenever he translated the Bible into the Latin. This word for horn was mistranslated, and I think it was like a valve went from A to E, and it was the word for actual horns. So this led to a lot of the art in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to depict Moses as having horns in a lot of the statues. The most famous one probably is Michelangelo's Moses statue, and then in a lot of the artwork. So this is one that's kind of I don't know. It's baffling to me how that might happen, but just one little mistranslation could cause a lot of people to not understand what it actually was. So at one point, the Louvre had an exhibit here in Oklahoma City, and we took the family there, and this was, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 years ago. And I remember seeing a bust of Moses, the statue, and I think it was a replica. It wasn't, I know it wasn't the real thing. It may have, there were multiple statues created like this. And so whenever I saw it, I'm looking at it, and I'm reading the caption below, and I'm thinking that looks off. And one of the workers was there. There wasn't a tour guide or anything, but he could tell that I was kind of questioning what's going on here, and And he said, well, a lot of the artwork back then was depicted this way. It was like kind of a trend or a fad to do that. And I just kind of took that as, okay, that it's kind of weird. But, years later, I find out that that's the reason is because of the mistranslation in the Latin Vulgate, which was a good translation because it helped the common people understand God's word. Anytime whenever a language becomes dead, like the Hebrew language or the Greek language, was good for a new translation to come along, and this was the translation. But for hundreds of years, the artwork was depicting Moses as having these horns, which is not. It was a misrepresentation of what actually happened, because we know that it was a bright light based off of other scriptures with the same word, the same Hebrew word. It's obviously not actual horns. So to go into that, that's kind of a lot to go into, but it's kind of something that I think, I don't know, it was interesting to me to figure out that after all those years, why that statue had horns. So God displays his glory and his grandeur, and he did that through Moses and his face shining, and it was a bright light. It's like a transfiguring light, just like we read in the transfiguration of Jesus. Luke chapter 9 has that, and I'm going to read. There's a lot of similarities there. In Luke chapter 9, it says here that it happened in chapter 9, verse 29. As he prayed, the appearance of his face was altered, and his robe became white and glistening. And behold, two men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah. And then later Peter said, he asks him, should we make 3 tabernacles now that, we see, you and Elijah and Moses together? Well, we're going to find, in later studies that after Moses comes down and gives the law to the Israelites, the next thing that's going to happen is the instructions to build the tabernacle happens. That's where God is going to dwell now, is in the tabernacle, because he told them, his presence was going to be taken from them. The pillar of cloud and the way that they had seen his presence before was all changing just because of their disobedience. Well, so we're going to go into the tabernacle in further lessons. So God displays his glory and grandeur. He provides a mediator. Just like Moses was a mediator to the Israelites, Jesus is our mediator. And God's presence is known. That's the final characteristic that I've got listed out here. His presence is known. Whether if it was a pillar of cloud, or whether if it was in the tabernacle or in the temple, his presence is known. Jesus tells us, you are the temple. Well, we read in the New Testament, we're all the temple. Our body is the temple, and in Peter he talks about how we're all living stones put together as a temple. So the church is where God's presence resides today. And then we finish out in chapter 35 in Exodus, the Sabbath command. So then Moses gathered all the congregations of the children of Israel together, and he said to them, "These are the words which the Lord has commanded you to do. You shall work. Your work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th day shall be a holy day for you, Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does not work on it shall be put to death, and you shall kindle no fire throughout your dwellings on the Sabbath day." So the Sabbath day was the day of rest, and just as the tabernacle was a holy space, God was securing that 7th day as a holy time. He gives us, he was giving them not only the space, but the time to be holy. So that's basically what I had here, those characteristics. First was God is merciful. He renewed the covenant with them. He's patient. He gives warnings, and he gave warnings to the Israelites. He also expects his people to be responsible, and then he gives instructions, and we follow his instructions. God displays his glory and grandeur, and he provides a mediator. Just like he provided Moses, Jesus is the better mediator. He's much better. All the things of the new covenant are much better, much easier for us as Christians. I'm glad that we're on this side of the cross, and we don't have to go back and follow all these rules and regulations. Jesus made it way easier for us. And God's presence is known. So that's my last lesson for this evening. Just like we always do, I want to be able to offer an invitation for anybody who needs prayers of the church, anybody who is in need, anybody who may want to put on Christ in baptism. You can do so as we come forward and sing.